Greetings, I'm Dwane Starlin. I'm a licensed DC tour guide and a longtime resident of the Georgetown neighborhood. I'm happy to bring this tour to you. A plethora of campaign signs found planted in front yards, as well as taped on every tree and post along the way, lent a holiday or carnival air to our neighborhood recently. Thanks this year to COVID-19, there were many ways to cast your vote. You could go with absentee ballots via the USPS or secure ballot box spreads throughout the city. There were early voting locales that were open during daylight hours for several weeks before the actual voting. And finally, voting on the election day at regularly assigned places. All this led to a long period of balloting as precipitated by safe distancing, masks, and other precautions. Hence, this time around, I'm taking the virtual or digital approach for this tour. Georgetown was founded by Act of the Province of Maryland on May 15th, 1751. It was carved out of Frederick County, which itself had only been removed from Prince George's County 3 years earlier. It should come as no surprise that the corporation of Georgetown, as it was known, did not extend any voting rights to non-white men or any women whatsoever. This continued after 1801, when the city was incorporated into the newly formed District of Columbia. In 1801, Washington, D.C. officially opened as the capital of the U.S., with the first presidential election being across the country. As you may remember, that election resulted in a tie between Jefferson and Burr that had to be broken by Congress. The city became immersed in politics, and things were never the same ever since. Today, the first Tuesday in November is practically a holiday. In 1960, John Kennedy ran against Richard Nixon for the presidency. Georgetown's significant interest in the race was sparked by the fact that JFK had lived and started a family there before entering the White House in January 1961. The 1960 US presidential election was the 44th presidential election. It was held on Tuesday, November 8, 1960. This was the first election in which 50 states participated and the last in which the District of Columbia did not. It was also the first election in which an incumbent president was not eligible to run for a third term because of the term limits established by the 22nd Amendment. It is also the last election where the winning candidate lost Ohio. Kennedy won a 303 to 219 electoral college victory, and it is generally considered to have been a victory by a popular vote of only 112,827 ballots, or a mere margin of 0.17%. The 1960 presidential election was the closest election since 1916. Kennedy campaigning skills decisively outmatched Nixon, who wasted time and resources campaigning in 50 states, while Kennedy focused on campaigning in only the populous swing states. Kennedy's popular vote margin was the narrowest in the 20th century. Had Nixon been elected at the age of 48 years, 11 days, he would have been the fourth youngest president at the date of his inauguration. Kennedy, by contrast, was only 43 years, 236 days, making him the second youngest man to begin a presidency. Theodore Roosevelt, who assumed the presidency upon the assassination of William McKinley, was the youngest. I was born and raised on a cattle ranch and wheat farm on the high plains of northeastern Colorado during the Second World War. I'd never heard of John Kennedy until I entered the freshman class at the University of Colorado in the fall of 1960. I was only 17 and not eligible to vote in the presidential election that November, and took only a passing glance at the contest between the two candidates. Because of all my acclimating to college life away from my rural home surroundings, I paid very little attention to this contest. The gift outright. The land was ours when we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. She was ours in Massachusetts, Virginia. But we were England's, still colonials, possessing what we still were unpossessed by what we now no more possessed. Something in we were was withholding us, making us weak, until we found that it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living, and forthwith found salvation in surrender. Such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. The deed of gift was many deeds of war. To the land vaguely realizing westward, but still unstoried, artless, unenhanced. Such as she was, such as she would become. I did watch the inauguration on January 20th, 1961 on TV. It was a very bitter, cold, windy day. I remember witnessing the great American poet Robert Frost as he struggled with his reading of a poem that he had purportedly written just for this event. Unable to read it due to the weather conditions, he switched and recited the one that he had written earlier. PT 109 is the story of the sinking of that boat during the Second World War, and it was featured in several books, as well as a 1963 movie, PT 109, starring Cliff Robertson. Other actors considered for the lead were Peter Fonda, who objected to having to deliver his screen test using an impersonation of Kennedy's voice. Other candidates were Warren Beatty, Jacqueline Kennedy's choice, Jeffrey Hunter, who had just finished playing Jesus Christ in King of Kings, and several Warner Brother television contract stars, Ed Burns, Peter Brown, Chad Everett, and Roger Smith. JFK had set 3 conditions for the film: that it be historically accurate, that the profits go to the survivors of the PT 109 families, and that he would have the final choice of the lead actor. He selected and then met with Robertson after viewing the screen test. Although Robertson bore very little physical resemblance to Kennedy and was nearly 38 or 39 years old at the time the film was made, he was told that the president picked him not because he was a fine actor, but also because he was young enough and mature enough so that the world would not get the idea that the president was being played by a parking lot attendant. Ed Burns said in his autobiography, Kooky No More, "I was told President John Kennedy didn't want to be played by Kooky." After seeing the film, JFK called PT 109 a good product, but worried about the 2-hour, 20-minute length. It was just a question of whether there was too much of it. There was also a song, PT 109 by Jimmy Dean, that reached number 8 on the pop music list and number 3 on the country music charts in 1962, making it one of Dean's most successful recordings. President Kennedy presented PT 109 Thai class to his close friends and key staff members. Replicas of the Thai class were still sold to the public by the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. An original flag from PT 109 is now kept at that museum. By the time November 22nd, 1963 rolled around, I had observed Walter Cronkite on CBS TV announcing JFK's assassination. I therefore became quite interested in that man from Boston. But then LBJ was sworn in, and my attention focused on my education and the Vietnam War. The first Kennedy elected to a public office was Patrick Joseph P.J. Kennedy in 1884, 35 years after the family's arrival from Ireland. He served in the Massachusetts state legislature from 1884 until 1895. Later, at least one Kennedy family member served in federal elective office every year from 1947 to 2011, a span of 64 years. The descendants of PJ's son, Joseph P. Kennedy, and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy included John F. Kennedy, who served in the United States Congress, U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who later was also a senator, 4 other members of the United States House of Senate, 2 ambassadors, 1 lieutenant governor, 3 state legislators, and 1 mayor. In addition, Joseph and Rose's daughter Eunice founded the National Institute of Children's Health, which was part of the National Institutes of Health. She later founded the Special Olympics. Eunice's daughter, Maria Shriver, served as First Lady of California. Other descendants of Joseph and Rose Kennedy have been active as lawyers, authors, activists on behalf of those with physical and intellectual challenges. Joe Sr. grew up as an Irish Catholic outsider in East Boston, struggling to secure jobs in finance that his less qualified Protestant banker friends were stepping into with ease. In 1928, he sold 2 of his small film studios, creating RKO Pictures. After gaining immense wealth selling short on the Wall Street crash, as well as flipping Hollywood studios, he became a multimillionaire by the age of 40. He began his short career in public service in 1934 as the first ever head of the Securities and Exchange Commission under his longtime friend, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When Kennedy then asked for the British ambassadorship, FDR decided that the no-nonsense Kennedy was actually the right man for the job. Kennedy promptly promoted a plan to relocate European Jews abroad, but failed to inform the State Department, and the plan fizzled. Kennedy continued for years to loudly advocate for appeasement in London and at home, arguing that Britain would be destroyed otherwise. His attempts to get a personal meeting with Adolf Hitler never materialized. Thus ended Joseph Sr.'s public service career. His oldest son, bomber pilot Joseph Jr., died in an explosion over the English Channel in 1944, participating in a war that his father opposed. Suffering a debilitating stroke in 1961, Kennedy was forced to sit, trapped in his own failing body, as 2 of his sons, Jack and Bobby, were assassinated in the tumultuous decade to come. For the last 8 years of his life, Kennedy was unable to write or speak at all. Personally, I had put JFK on the back burner once I graduated from college and was concentrating on employment and starting a family in Colorado. As fate would have it, I accepted a temporary 1-year assignment in Washington, D.C. in early 1984. Once nested down in the area, I began exploring, primarily on foot, the neighborhood which immediately became my favorite, Georgetown. I spent much of my spare time soaking up its history. When the new millennium started, I obtained my DC tour guide license and have continued to learn the marvelous past of Georgetown and the capital city. It was then that I realized that JFK favored Georgetown. and I began to gather stories about his life here. When I started leading Georgetown tours over the last decade, I found that both visitors and locals were interested in the 35th president's existence in Georgetown. And settling upon an annual event near November 22nd seemed to spark even more interest. My approach was to have a specific starting point and lead my customers on a path of the most closely connected points of interest. This year, with COVID-19 curtailing my actual walking tours, I have switched to online or virtual tours. As I worked on this presentation for Kennedys in Georgetown, I realized a chronological or timeline approach might put the Kennedy presence in a fresh light. We won't be walking between locales as we talk about the Kennedy family presence. I have elected to start from the time that JFK came to the Capitol as a congressman in 1946. And will continue on until the 1,000 days he served as president, which ended in November 22nd, 1963. 3513 N Street Northwest is where Holy Trinity Parish was founded in 1787, and it is the oldest Roman Catholic community and house of worship in continuous operation in both Georgetown and the larger city of Washington, D.C. The original church building was completed in 1794. President Kennedy, a Roman Catholic, and his family frequently worshiped at Holy Trinity. Kennedy's attendance is commemorated by a plaque on the front of the church building. 1528 31st Street Northwest. In November 1946, JFK rented this townhouse after his runaway victory in the 11th Massachusetts Congressional District. He shared it with his aide, Billy Sutton, Margaret Ambrose, a longtime Kennedy cook, and his 23-year-old sister Eunice, who was an executive secretary at the Department of Justice. Many guests were entertained at this locale, including Sergeant Shriver, who ended up marrying Eunice in May 1953, 7 years later. While in residence here, JFK and Eunice learned of their sister Kathleen's death in a plane crash. (1400 34th Street Northwest). JFK shared this house with his sister Eunice from 1949 to 1951. Eunice Mary Kennedy was born in Brookline, Massachusetts in 1921. Fifth of 9 children, she graduated from Stanford University. She became executive vice president of the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation in 1957. She founded the Special Olympics in 1968. She married Sergeant Shriver in 1953. Her husband served as the U.S. ambassador to France from 1968 to 1970, and then was the 1970 Democratic U.S. vice presidential candidate, along with George McGovern as the presidential candidate. Eunice died in 2009, and Sergeant passed away in 2011. In May of 1951, JFK and Jacqueline Bouvier met at a dinner party in Georgetown. JFK reportedly told friends afterward, "I never met anyone like her." Jacqueline Lee Bouvier was born on July 28, 1929. In 1951, she graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in French literature from George Washington University and went to work immediately for the Washington Times-Herald as an inquiring photographer. (3260 N Street Northwest is only a block away, and that is where Henry Cabot Lodge II lived during the 1950s and 1960s. He too had graduated from Harvard. After his Senate seat, he served as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations until he joined Richard Nixon in the 1960 presidential race as his VP candidate. Later on, he lost the special election to fill JFK's empty Senate seat to Ted Kennedy. We now move to 3271 P Street Northwest. JFK rented this home in January 1953 after being elected a Massachusetts senator the previous November. He attended Ike's inaugural ball with Jacqueline Bouvier on January 20th, 1953. Next, 1264 Wisconsin Avenue, Martin's Tavern. JFK lived just 2 blocks from Martin's Tavern. Every Sunday after Mass at Holy Trinity, he came to Martin's, read his Sunday paper, and enjoyed breakfast in booth number 1. Years later, Martin's staff and customers would catch glimpses of JFK writing the first draft of his inaugural speech. Richard Nixon, as a congressman, then senator from California, and later as vice president of the United States, enjoyed Martin's meatloaf in booth number 2, usually with colleagues from Congress and the administration. On June 24, 1953, JFK proposed to Jacqueline Bouvier in booth number 3, which is now called the proposal booth. Bouvier had just returned from London while covering the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II for the Washington Times Herald. JFK and Jackie were married at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Newport, Rhode Island on September 12, 1953. They lived at Marywood, her family's estate located across Chain Bridge in Virginia. Moving to 3231 Dent Place. This is where they lived, by they, Jack and Jackie, from May until December 1954. Jackie attended Georgetown's foreign language school at 37th and Q Street, Northwest, while JFK commuted back and forth to Massachusetts in accordance with his responsibilities as a congressman. He started having back pain during the summer of 1954. During the August recess, JFK underwent surgery. The Kennedys spent the remainder of 1954 in Massachusetts while JFK recuperated. In 1955, the couple moved to Hickory Hill at 1147 Chain Bridge Road in McLean, Virginia. 2808 P Street Northwest. Jack and Jackie rented this townhouse from January to May 1957. This is the year that Profiles of Courage won the Pulitzer Prize. Jack had published the collection of 8 political leaders during his recuperation from a second back surgery in 1955. JFK and Jackie moved here from Hickory Hill, where they lived from 1955 to 1957. They sold that estate in McLean to Bobby and Ethel Kennedy after Jack and Jackie lost their first child in 1956. 3307 N Street Northwest is where they lived from 1957 to 1961. Senator Kennedy bought this townhouse in mid-1957. Both Caroline and John Jr. were born during this time. Jack won re-election as senator in 1958. Then, on January 20th, 1960, he announced his intentions to run for president. The Kennedys reigned here until they moved into public housing, or the White House. 3302 N Street Northwest, directly across the street, was occupied by Mrs. Helen Montgomery, who hosted various members of the press with refreshments and shelter during the bitter cold winter of 1960-61. On January 20th, 1961, after his inauguration, JFK stopped by 3302 on his way to church at Holy Trinity to help dedicate a plaque to his neighbor. Down the street at 3321 N Street Northwest is where Ben Bradley, editor of the Washington Post, and his second wife, Toni, lived and socialized with the Kennedys. Bradley wrote a book entitled Conversations with Kennedy, also winning a Pulitzer. Toni's sister, Mary Pashommeyer, used a room above the home's garage as a part-time studio. Later on, she was frequently mentioned as a visitor to the White House when Jackie was out of town. At the C&O towpath in 1964, Mary Pashomeyer's body was found murdered. Very close to 3321 and 3307 N Street, the crime remains unsolved to this day. (2900) P Street Northwest is where JFK stayed in the home of his good friend and artist Bill Walton for 3 days while Jackie packed to move the family into the White House. His stay there is well documented in the book Grace and Power, The Private World of the Kennedy White House by Sally Bedell Smith. (3044) O Street Northwest. When the Kennedys were in the White House, Jackie's mother and stepfather, Janet and Hugh Alkencloss, lived here. John Jr. and Caroline would often come to play. Janet Alkencloss had the blood-spattered pink suit that Jackie wore in the Dulles removed from her White House closet and boxed up, putting it in Janet's attic at O Street, where it remained until it was removed to the National Archives. Then 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest. The newly elected Kennedy administration indicated in February 1961 that it was anxious to retain the existing historic homes on Lafayette Square. In 1962, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy lobbied the General Service Administration to stop demolition and adopt a different design plan. The wreckers haven't started yet, and until they do, it can be saved, she wrote. Mrs. Kennedy envisioned and enlisted architect John Warnke to create a design which incorporated the new buildings into old. Next, 3038 N Street Northwest, where Jackie and her 2 children stayed for 4 months immediately after JFK's assassination. It was made available by Averill and Marie Harriman. They moved out and loaned their home to Jackie as temporary quarters. She resided there until she bought the home at 3017 N Street nearby. 3017 N Street Northwest was purchased by Jackie shortly after her husband's assassination, and she intended to make it her permanent home. But she found it impractical to raise John Jr. and Caroline in the Georgetown fishbowl, where tour buses often parked outside her front door. She moved to New York City in 1964, following the lead of her sister Lee, and purchased a 15-floor, 14-room apartment at 1040 Fifth Avenue, just 7 blocks from Lee's Co-op. Ben Bradley and his third wife, Sally Quinn, later lived across the street at 3014 N Street Northwest. That was also the former home of Abe Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln. Jackie married Greek shipping tycoon Aristoteles Onassis in 1968, and they remained there until his death in 1975. She then returned to New York City, where she began a career in publishing and lived the rest of her life in the company of international diamond merchant Maurice Templesman until her death in 1994 at the age of 64. (1607) 28th Street Northwest was where Teddy, the youngest brother and son of Jack Kennedy, and John and Joe Jr. lived during the 1960s after he was elected to his brother's senatorial position from Massachusetts. This home sold recently to Evermay Georgetown LLC for $12 million. Next, the Arlington National Cemetery. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, and John Carl Warnke was chosen by Mrs. Kennedy to design the president's tomb. Coincidentally, the president and Warnke had visited this site in March of 1963, when and where the president admired the peaceful atmosphere of the place. Mrs. Kennedy told friends she wanted an eternal flame at the gravesite. The site was enlarged due to Jacqueline Kennedy's desire to have her deceased children, Patrick and Arabella. Arabella was a stillborn daughter born in 1956, reinterred next to their father. She had read that in 1865, President Abraham Lincoln had been buried next to his deceased son, Willie, and she recalled her husband's desire to be buried with his family. A small white cross was placed at the head of Arabella's grave, and a small white headstone placed at the head of Patrick's. An expansion to the gravesite was dedicated in 1971 to accommodate Robert Kennedy's grave, only about 50 feet away. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was buried at the site alongside her husband following her death in May 1994. Senator Edward M. Kennedy was buried 100 feet south of Robert Kennedy's memorial between two maple trees shortly after his death in August 2009. The 220-year-old Arlington oak, which stood off-center within the Kennedy Memorial gravesite, was uprooted on August 27, 2011 during Hurricane Irene. On Arbor Day, April 27, 2012, a sapling grown from an acorn of the original Arlington oak was planted and dedicated. The John F. Kennedy Center for Performing Arts was opened on September 8, 1971. In the grand foyer of the Kennedy Center is a huge mud bust of JFK. It was made by renowned sculptor Robert Burks, who used the same style of artfully shredded clay on his Albert Einstein statue outside the National Academy of Sciences on Constitution Avenue Northwest. This center hosts many different genres of performance art, such as theater, dance, orchestras, jazz, pop, and folk music. Nearby is the Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis Hall at the George Washington University. It was renamed for alumni Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis in 1995. Designed and built in 1938, it's 8 stories high and features 2 bays. It is now listed on the District of Columbia Inventory of Historic Sites and the National Register of Historic Places. I would like to end this presentation with the poem that Robert Frost had written for JFK swearing in. Summoning artists to participate in the August occasions of the state, seems something that artists should celebrate. Today is for my cause a day of days, and his be poetry's old-fashioned praise. Who was the first to think of such a thing? This verse that in acknowledgement I bring goes back to the beginning of the end, what had been for centuries the trend. A turning point in modern history, colonial had been the thing to be, as long as the great issue was to see. A golden age of poetry and power of this noonday's the beginning hour. Thank you for your attention.